All right, what's up, Gromies? Welcome to Office Hours, your source for free cannabis cultivation education. I'm Keisha. Welcome to episode 73. I am moderating solo today, but y'all know the drill. We are going live on YouTube, so if you're logging in over there, be sure to post your questions. I'll also keep an eye out for questions in the chat. Drop them anytime, and if your question gets picked, we'll either have you unmute yourself or I will ask for you. Also, be sure you're following us on all the platforms. We are on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Social Club. With that, let's get started. Jason and Seth, how you guys doing today?
Good.
Excellent. Y'all sound ready. Let's go. Okay. Dave Wright submitted this question a few weeks ago, and he also sent a follow-up. So let's start with that. He's looking for some tips for resolving or avoiding nitrogen toxicity. We've been dealing with some nitrogen toxicity throughout the multiple stages of growth all of a sudden, feeding 1 gallon cocoa pods at 6.0 to 6.2 pH, 2.3 to 3 EC, happening in both HPS and LED rooms. Runoff pH was a bit high at times. Here's what he added. In addition to that, we're seeing some situations P1 runoff is 5.5-ish and P2 runoff is hitting 6.5. Any idea why this would be happening? Input pH is 5.8 to 6.1, 2.8 to 3 EC, HPS room. What do you guys think?
Let's hit the first half of that. One of the things to kind of keep in mind is in that LED room, you might need to start running a little bit higher ECs, just depending on how that plant's feeding. Obviously, nitrogen uptake is something that's not very well regulated by the plant. I think as Seth has mentioned a few episodes back. And so if we're getting low on nutrients across the board in there, it's definitely going to be getting some extra nitrogen in relationship to the other nutrients that it's pulling. One of the easiest ways to identify if you're running low on EC is time series data. So looking at, hey, as our water contents decrease, after our feeds, does our EC start to rise? If it starts to drop, that means the plant is eating nutrients faster than the salts or the nutrients are concentrating in that substrate. So that might be one thing to definitely take a look at specifically for the LED room. For the HPS room, obviously going in at say 6.0 to 6.2 for the pH. If you're cocoa, 1 gallon bags, that's exactly where you want to be. So that should be helping regulate some of the nitrogen uptake. Obviously, lower pHs would make nitrogen solubility a little bit higher. Seth, what do you think for those HPS rooms?
Well, big thing that keys me in is kind of the pH that you're feeding in at, and then looking at what kind of media you have and possible amendments it has. If we're above a 6.0 generally in the root zone, we're going to see really unrestricted nitrogen uptake. Actually, that's part of why we want to be down below a 6.0. If we look at that plant nutrient availability, we're actually able to restrict nitrogen a little bit by lowering that pH. And then, as Jason said, low EC conditions. So building up that osmotic pressure allows us to kind of regulate a little bit what the plant's bringing in. So if it's harder for the plant to pick up pretty much anything, then obviously nitrogen is going to be difficult too. And then, for your particular situation, we talk about it here a lot. Sometimes being able to run a nutrient program that allows you to pull back on the nitrogen a little bit can be beneficial, but it's really hard to correlate a lot of these things without a root zone EC measurement. So regardless of your feed EC, we always want to see what EC we're seeing in the root zone. Just as Jason said, if our baseline's low and then it's eating everything we're putting in, that's a different situation in relation to our pH than if we have a solid baseline built up and we're actually seeing that EC rise as the water dries out and we're watching that osmotic pressure build. So EC, pH, and then make sure you're watering adequately and resetting that nutrient balance if you have something like that going on,
Wonderful. Thank you guys for that. And Dave Ray, good luck out there. Thanks for your patience. We were a little bit behind. We've had so many great questions. So appreciate your follow-up on that. Keep us posted. All right. Mikey just posted a question here in the chat. Mikey, I'm going to read it. If you want to unmute yourself and add to it, please feel free. He's looking for ideal flower temps for LED rooms. At what VPD and at what length of time can we cause plant stress?
So for LEDs, obviously we've got a little bit lower room temp to radiation ratio. And basically what's going on there is, since LEDs are going to have less far red, less of the photons are causing heat rise in the surface of those leaves. And so what usually we're looking at is anywhere from 80 degrees to 84 degrees for daytime temps starting off in flower. Obviously, as we progress through flower, we like to start to induce a nighttime differential. Yeah, it might even definitely lower your daytime temps just a little bit. Obviously, that night day offset, typically for the first third of the cycle. And this is, for a very generic strain, just start somewhere with this. And the more data you can collect on the strain and how much you need to do these temperature offsets is kind of the best way to go about growing a strain the best. But middle of the road, so first, say, third of the cycle, 0 to 5 degree temperature differential. For the second third, usually around the 5 degree temperature differential, and for the last third up to about 10 degrees night day differential.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the challenges with switching over to LED is a lot of the information out there was built out around growing under HPSs, which usually accounts for that leaf temp offset, that, elevated leaf temp compared to the ambient air around it. And with LEDs, we have the exact opposite. And when we're looking at LEDs, there's a variety of products out in the market. And one of the easiest ways to really figure out what's going on in your room, and I mean, airflow comes into this too. We've got a lot of airflow, LEDs, not a lot of radiant heat. We typically have to run the rooms a fair bit warmer, but every grower's best bet is actually going and getting a laser thermometer, or if you're really fancy, get a FLIR camera so you can really get some cool averages. But go see what your leaf temps are doing. And what we're targeting there is, that 0.6 to 0.9 VPD through Gen, even raising that up to a 1.0 towards the end of week 3. And then, going into that 1.2 to 1.4 range. And really at the end of the day, we're targeting that leaf surface VPD. We just have to work with values that we can actually easily measure every day. And as far as your question is how long, I mean, the longer you're out of a VPD range, the more your plant's going to adapt to it, right? But when it adapts to that not optimal VPD range, we're not going to see as good a production either. So, when we look at those VPD ranges, the smaller you can keep that dead band, and the narrower range you can keep your plants in day and night. So if we're saying 0.6 to 0.9, that's day and night. We're saying 1.2 to 1.4, that's also day and night. So keeping it in that range both times is, crucial to achieving like max transpiration, which is what we're looking for, maximum productivity. Anytime you go outside of that dead band, that plant has to adapt to the conditions outside of it, whether it's low humidity or high humidity. And what the end result is loss of production time. So, I mean, there is no minimum or maximum amount of time you can be out of VPD range. But you're potentially leaving production on the table the more time you spend out of it.
Yeah, just kind of, talked about some advanced ways to know what the ideal conditions are. Yeah, Seth mentioned thermal cameras. They're my absolute favorite way to start looking at leaf surface temperatures. Obviously, I put some pictures up here. I've done a couple of tutorials on YouTube on how important they can be. And simply just because, if I have a decent thermal camera, I can get it, a few thousand samples in one picture at an instant time. I can get kind of a scan across the whole canopy as far as how much sampling I'm catching. And, in different parts of the plant, you're going to see 5 to 10 degree temperature difference. If I accidentally use my laser thermometer and I hit a cola instead of a leaf, things going to be way hotter than a leaf, and it's going to give me a bad reading to make adjustments off of. The absolute sure way to get an idea of how you've optimized your environment is by looking at stomatal conductance. And so the stomatal conductance, we're always shooting for the highest stomatal conductance that we can get at a given CO2 level. And if you want to, make slight incremental changes into your environment, if you have the ability to take stomatal samples, then it's going to give you an idea whether you've improved the rate that plant can grow at or gone the wrong way. There's always going to be thresholds, right? And so if we go up too high in temperature, that plant's stomates are going to start to close up a little bit. Our transpiration rates are going to go down, and vice versa. If we decrease the temperature and humidity outside of the ideal range, those stomates are going to close up a little bit, and we're going to have just slightly less growth, depending on how far out of range that we're shooting for. And Seth did bring up day and night VPDs. We're always stressing that daytime VPDs are much more important than daytime or nighttime, VPDs. Nighttime VPDs are important because we're trying to, one, keep that plant in a stable environment, two, avoid susceptibility for molds and mildews to grow. But really what's happening is without the photo period, without the lights on, the plant is transpiring significantly less. And so those VPD, that VPD range at night is going to be much wider because it's not affecting the rate of plant growth nearly as much as that VPD range during photo period on.
Awesome, y'all. Thank you for that answer. Mikey, great question. Thank you for posting that. All right, we're going to keep it moving. We got a lot going on YouTube. First of all, some shout outs. Poppy Grows wrote in. Just want to say, love the chat. Watched a few older bids and just helped me so much with what I got going on right now. You guys are amazing. Love the show. We appreciate you, Poppy. Thank you. True Exotic and Clone wrote in. Love you guys. Thanks so much for all your help. I've learned so much from listening on car rides. That's right. We're amazing to take on a road trip. So thank you, True Exotic and Clone. All right, Jay dropped a question here. They want to know, in regards to far red supplementation towards the end of the flowering phase, how would you suggest adding the far red continuous staggered set times within 12, 12, etc.? Also, at what week in flower? What advice do you guys have for Jay?
So, I mean, let's kind of just start out by breaking down the science of far red and how it affects the plant. So usually far red, we're looking at, in the range of 700 nanometers plus. I think specifically it's, defined as a slightly different range than that, but sure, for intensive purposes in this conversation, we're going to say, 700 or 740 plus nanometers of light wavelength. And basically what's happening is in those higher wavelengths, higher frequency wavelengths, that's where your chlorophyll B is reacting to the photons. And so the way the plant is processing that is going to be slightly different than full spectrum. Obviously, as we mentioned the other week, it's really about the levels of each type of light wavelength that's coming through rather than the balance of those. And so when we think about supplementing with far red, really what we're doing is starting to, tell that plant, hey, let's balance you to a even more generative type of hormone. And so what that's going to be doing is giving this plant a reproductive response, saying, hey, let's make as much reproductive growth as we possibly can. As from the millions of years of this plant growing, it's adapted to more far reds during fall time as the apex angle of the sun. Is that an apex angle? No.
The angle that the rays are going through the atmosphere. They're
exactly.
going through more atmosphere.
Got to go through more atmosphere.
Shallower.
And so those far reds are typically going to start to be more intense towards fall. And then that plant's been adapted to knowing that in the fall time, it needs to be as reproductive as possible. That's the evolution of the plant. If it can produce those types of plant parts before everything freezes out or it runs out of growing season, it's more likely to reproduce and evolve into that. So when exactly is going to be definitely strain dependent.
Usually when the plant starts ripening, if we're looking at generally about 2 weeks before harvest is what we're looking at with most plants. And then there's always going to be some of those oddball genetics that aren't going to respond the same way other plants do for a variety of reasons. One of the important things to remember about that also is, when we're looking at plant maturity, we've got biosynthetic pathways for different cannabinoids and terpenes. So that's also another part of it's not just chlorophyll. It's not just the way the plant's responding, but we're also causing degradation of different molecules that lead to a different final expression. As far as supplementing that goes, you've got a few different options. You got your classic mixed light HPS, and then, some of the newer LEDs have far red built into them. There's also far red supplementation in the form of LED light bars. In terms of how much of your total light load you need in far red, I wish I had numbers for you. And as far as staggering it on, I haven't seen any definitive evidence one way or another whether actually staggering it in and increasing amounts is going to help that much, or if just starting to make sure you've got that range included in your light spectrum is actually going to be what gets you there.
Yeah, and I think a really important thing to think about here as well is pretty much any light source that you have, unless you're building your own LEDs from diodes, are going to have some amount of full spectrum. Even LEDs are going to be containing some amount of far red, typically, from every manufacturer that I've seen. And in order to get the best plant growth, there has to be some amount of balance in all of this. So even when we're saying, hey, go generative stacking, or when we're going vegetative bulking, there's still some aspects that are keeping that plant balanced for the most amount of growth as possible. Obviously, I guess we'll take an anecdote right now from my experiences at my place this year. Is I've got some tomatoes outside and I've got some tomatoes inside, and my tomatoes outside are probably as generative as I could grow a plant, simply because I don't have my greenhouse built up yet, and they're going through nights at usually 40 degrees, 40 to 45 degrees, and daytime temps in the 90 to 100 degrees. So obviously VPDs all over the place. And then my indoor plants are at usually around 70 to 75 degrees all the time. And the plant morphology is very cool to look at next to each other. My tomatoes inside are probably 6 feet tall, yet I don't have nearly the bud onset, and they're not even close to turning red yet. Whereas outside, I'm looking at plants that are 2.5 feet tall, and they're blowing up with fruit, but they're gonna run out of capacity to make more fruit, simply because of the lack of plant infrastructure.
All right. You heard it, Jay. Good luck out there. Keep us posted on what you're doing. All right. We got one more question here. We did not plant this question. I welcome it, though. Holy Nodes wants to know what crop steering software we recommend. So I guess that's an opportunity for us to talk about why Arroyo is such a great crop steering software. Go for it.
I mean, to start out with, just the sensor quality. If you're not getting good data streaming into the software you're trying to process it with, you're not going to get very repeatable results. Accuracy is one thing, precision is another. And if you don't have both, you're going to be chasing your tail one way or both ways. And then as far as Arroyo itself goes, I think, Jason, you could probably speak to this. From the outset, it was designed with cannabis cultivators in mind for the cannabis cultivation process, which I think is part of what differentiates it. You want to give them some specifics?
Yeah. I mean, so, a lot of it came from my day-to-day struggles as a cultivator, and just how many different systems that I had to use in order to get the information I needed. So that's why we're looking at target ranges and alerts built right into the system. We're looking at things like ability to tag the chart with notes, tasks, IPM events, pictures, just to really attribute things more than the data, because the data itself doesn't explain what's happening. It just explains the raw output of the parameters in a room or in a root zone. And so kind of trying to equip growers with the tool set all in one interface. I was going to say the next best thing about using Arroyo as a crop steering platform is the advice that you get from us is directly built off of our experience in there. Obviously, you're by using Arroyo, you're supporting the educational resources that Seth and I are producing here right now, and so it's going to be directly paired with the values that we're talking about. Like you said, the sensor quality allows us to have fairly accurate calibrations built in through the software, and the advice that we give directly reflects those parameters.
Yeah, and I think one thing too is we're very agnostic when it comes to inputs. We're not tied to specific nutrient brands, light brands, fan brands. Name a product in a grow, and we're not specifically tied to it. So that's another part of it. We can look. We try to step back and teach people how to look at a holistic view and go, okay, it's not just your sensors. It's not just your fertilizer. It's not just this. It's a holistic view. And I think that's one thing that isn't always prevalent in quite a few industries, depending on who's trying to get the product out there, right? Like, our interest is in helping growers cultivate data and make better choices based on that data, not necessarily trying to sell them on any other products, not trying to tell them that any one thing is going to be the key, but more promote, I'll use this word carefully, sustainable growing, and not in the terms of we're the most environmentally friendly, but what's a way that you can operate that's going to be streamlined, profitable, and repeatable because you've quantified your operation and you have numbers and goals to hit now.
It's it's a balanced approach that we take as well because we kind of bring experience and science together into the recommendations that we make. It's not based of information out of a laboratory, and it's not based off of the grow in my basement from the 70s. It's just based on how do we help the tens of thousands of users that we have become more successful, and how do we get more of those users as successful as they possibly can be. And that comes with training. It comes with pairing up what does agriculture biology suggest is the right way to go. What do these results show? And they don't always match up. So it takes kind of a careful mitigation of outcomes.
Yeah, and I think one of the cool parts about it is, when you decide to invest in Arroyo, you're investing in some of the same sensing technology that universities across the world, various research institutions are using to gather their own substrate, climate data, soil data. So you're really getting access to data that's cutting edge. In a lot of other ways, if we look at pH meters, for instance, okay, if you don't want to go spend over $2,000 on a really nice benchtop pH meter, you're essentially buying an inferior product that's not going to give you quite as accurate and precise results, or at least not as easily. With Arroyo, you're skipping kind of the subpar, older tech, or essentially cheaper options, and we found a way to bring you this technology at a price that's like pretty affordable, I feel like, in terms of industry standards when it comes to things like substrate sensing.
It's it's at a price that you can really start to sample what your production looks like. Some of the products that were widely available before Arroyo came out were in that, say, $1,500 to $3,000 per substrate sensor, and I've worked with many of growers that ran into challenges where they just couldn't analyze the how much their drippers were clogged across the room because they had one plant with the sensor in it, and 999 without sensors in them. So that their ability to analyze uniformity really was not good.
Fantastic. Thank you guys for that overview. And Holy Nodes and anybody else out there who's interested in just learning more about what Arroyo can do, head over to arroyo.io, click book a demo. One of our professionals will talk you through it. But yeah, thank you guys for that. We're going to get right back to the questions that we have here. We have a lot from previous weeks that we haven't even gotten to, so I'm going to just get right into it. Mike wrote in recently, hey guys, I've loved the videos recently. I grow in Pro Mix HP, and I was wondering if you have any tips on dryback in the media. I haven't found much online. Figured you guys might be the ones to ask. And feed strength in Pro Mix, pretty much everything. It works great for me, but I'd love to be able to dial it in even more. Got any advice for Mike?
So when we're talking about Pro Mix, look at what your perlite ratio is in that mix. I would highly recommend doing a field capacity test and seeing where you're at compared to the volume of your substrate. And other than that, Pro Mix is kind of, that was the baseline before cocoa really hit the market. And also the number of growers exploded to the point where we're, starting to become taxing on peat bogs. It's not very environmental to strip mine peat bogs to grow cannabis. So that's partially where cocoa came from. Otherwise, peat moss and cocoa mixes have pretty much all the same soilless characteristics that we're looking for. So I'll just sum it up real quick. As long as you're getting a 10 to 15% dryback, you're in a fairly healthy size media. Obviously, pushing a little farther can be desired from time to time, all the way up to a 25% or so dryback. And then otherwise, as we've talked about before, just apply your generative, your vegetative, and your generative irrigation strategies to get through the crop.
Yeah, and on top of that, that field capacity test, anytime that you have questions about your media, just do some runoff tests as well. Take a look at what your take one amount of sample and charge it just with zero EC, and probably even just a basic a neutral pH or your feed pH, and do some runoff tests on that. So start collecting the very beginning of the runoff and see what it comes out as. It might give you an idea of how much, if you need to start washing that media a little bit, if you need to let it settle before you go into planting. So look at that, the EC of the runoff and the pH of the runoff. And from manufacturer to manufacturer, it always surprises me some of the differences I see in that.
Oh, absolutely. And then also, be aware that like just like the difference between Rockwool and cocoa, um, with something like ProMix, you are going to have a small amount of cation exchange capacity. So basically, that media will actually hold some of the salts that you're putting in. So if you're looking at any kind of irrigation tech or information out there, really probably align your goals with what someone just growing in cocoa would do.
Great tips, you guys. Thank you so much for that, Mike. Good luck out there. All right, Samuel dropped a question over on YouTube. They want to know how much dryback in straight can of cocoa, 5-gallon plastic pots. It looks like they're looking for a little dryback range guidance. What do y'all recommend?
So, in a 5-gallon, if it's 45% field capacity, we've got, say, I'm going to just rough this out for easy math, 2.5 gallons of water available in there. A big, healthy cannabis plant. And when I say big, I'm talking about as far as indoor production goes, looking at a 4 to 6.5 foot tall, healthy cannabis plant. Usually you're looking around, 3/4 of a gallon of transpiration in a day. And so as far as drybacks go, 0.75 of 2.5, what are you looking at? A quarter?
Yeah, I mean, the thing to look at there is unless you've got an excessively sized plant, you're not going to be able to steer it vegetatively very well at all. And that's kind of why we, not just us, but many cannabis cultivators out there have settled on a smaller pot size, because it actually does give us the ability to water the plant every day, which helps us keep that root zone fresh, well oxygenated, and avoid any root rot issues. And then the other reason is because we can go ahead and bulk it. So if you're in a 5-gallon pot and you're running indoor sized plants, typically what you're going to see is you're going to run, a small watering once a day, or you might be watering every other day earlier on and progressing to maybe once a day later in the run, but you're going to be growing a smaller plant for your pot size compared to the fact that you could probably grow the same size plant, a 4 to 6.5 foot tall, in a 1 to 2 gallon cocoa. But inadvertently, you're going to be pushing shorter internode spacing, pretty sizable nugs, hopefully, and really, really good quality. So it depends on what your goals are. That's part of why for many, many years, a good old 3 to 5 gallon pot, hand watered once a day or once or every other day, brought people in their garages great results.
If you're seeing a daily dryback of, say, 5% in a 5-gallon pot, you've probably got some pretty active plants.
Cool. Yeah. Samuel, thank you for the question and keep us posted. Good luck out there. All right. Going to keep it moving. We got this question on YouTube a couple weeks back from Noisefield. They posted, if runoff pH does drop below 5.6, what's the best way to reset the pot and bring pH back up? I usually dilute feed and increase shot sizes and runoff amounts, but results vary. Most of the time correcting the pH for a day or before dropping again. What do you guys think?
So I'd look into the root of the issue. Because simply yes, you can do a correction. It sounds like you're doing a correction in the right manner, but if that's not holding, and you've encountered this many a times, there's something else going on there. And it's probably just coming down to a nutrient imbalance, or the properties in that substrate that are causing that pH to drop. So if you are analyzing your feed EC, we talked about that kind of in the first question today. If you have enough nutrients and you are still seeing pH swings that are significant, like you're talking about, then go get a leaf tissue analysis. Start to see what ions, what characteristics of that nutrient is the plant feeding heavier on, and which ones aren't it. If you're not feeding enough nutrients in the first place, just up your nutrients.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the best place to start here. A tissue analysis is going to tell you a lot. The first place I would personally start with this, it sounded like you're running a diluted feed to correct your pH. An important thing to recognize with this problem is that the plant's taking up one type of ion and leaving another. So in order to reset that balance, we need a total amount of incoming ions to not only replace the ones that have been pulled out, but also help push out the excess ones we don't want. So if you're backing off on your feed, that actual feed, or, for lack of a better word, flush, is it's not going to have a lasting effect on your pH change because you haven't introduced enough ions into that solution to reset the balance. So a lot of times what we're looking at is feeding, sometimes higher than what you have been at, but potentially bigger feeds and trying to just push and reset that ionic balance. Given adequate EC levels and proper pH, we don't typically see deficiencies in a plant. So make sure all your bases are covered. And then really, like I said, look at the problem as like, hey, low pH is a depletion of one type of ion in the media, and we're not going to reset that without putting that negative charge back into it.
Awesome, you guys. Thank you for that. Yeah, I remember a few episodes, we had a lot of pH questions. So got a few of those left today. But yeah, appreciate that question. All right, Daniel just posted here in the chat. Daniel, I'm going to read this. And if you want to add to it, feel free to unmute yourself. I feel like I have seen more and more grows running what looks like a 4-inch Rockwool cube on top of a 2-gallon bag of cocoa. Doesn't the difference in CEC and field capacity between the two cause issues? I messaged one grower who told me he does this because of faster veg in Rockwool and better flower quality with cocoa. The second part of that reasoning just doesn't sit well with me. Plenty of good quality flower comes from Rockwool. What do you guys think?
It's actually a really pretty good option. In ideal situations, I do like to try and stick with one media type in the beginning of the plant life cycle through flower and harvest. That being said, 4-inch Rockwool cubes are very well known for their ability to be well controlled in the veg cycle. A lot of times, when we have a smaller media, we can cut down the veg times and have a more vigorous plant coming out of our 18-6 cycle. And on top of a 2-gallon bag, nice forgiving media for flower. We can push a 2-gallon 2-gallon bag pretty hard through the flower cycle. And so one of the things to think about there is, yes, as I mentioned, staying with one type is nice because of differences in CEC. Really, for me, it's just the hydraulic conductivity difference between the Rockwool and the cocoa, and the fact that we just have, a single little boundary layer, typically where the plastic wrap on the Rockwool ends, so the bottom of it. The thing being, though, is if we do have nice explosive root growth out of that 4x3 or 4x4 Rockwool cube, it's going to penetrate our 2-gallon cocoa bag fairly quickly, right? And so we're thinking about a rooting in time of usually 5 days, 6 days, and what that means is by that time, this plant is already adjusted, and it's almost its entire existence of pulling nutrients is going to be from that 2-gallon bag. So really, for me, the only concern or challenge of having that mixed media, and actually in this case, it's probably my favorite sizes of medias, so even better. But my biggest challenge there is thinking about how do we make sure that rooting in process is going to be as effective as possible. And another thing to kind of think about there is, once these plants have rooted into the 2-gallon cocoa, there's not a lot of ins and hairs of those roots that are pulling water from that 4x cube. It's mostly just starting to get enveloped with root crown. And so, usually by say day 7, we're really just thinking about that plant as being in a 2-gallon cocoa bag.
Yeah. I mean, you brought up an important point that I think, I don't know if we've talked about much on here, but we could expand on it a little bit. When we're talking, most perennial plants like annual plants, like cannabis, we're having root growth expand every year freshly. We're not regrowing that. All of that water absorption is happening, within the last couple inches to the tip of the root, only where the root hairs form. So to Jason's point, yes, exactly. Like all of our water absorption is actually happening primarily down in that suspended water table. That's where the highest water concentration is, and that's where the roots are most adapted to doing that. Basically, that is, to me, I agree with Jason. I don't love mixing Rockwool and cocoa, but it's not the worst as long as you look at what factors you have at play and the situation you're in. So part of that comes down to matching up what kind of Rockwool block are you going to use versus what kind of cocoa. Is your cocoa hitting 45% VWC at field capacity, or is it hitting 65? That's going to dictate what kind, what type of Rockwool I might choose. I might go with something like a par grow if I'm trying to grow in really low VWC media. If I've got something higher, like several companies out there right now that hit easily 60 to 70% field capacity on their straight cocoa. Well, fortunately, that's right in the same range as what I typically see with my Rockwool, especially after I've got a plant rooted into it. And then, that is one of the dangers, right? If we have a Rockwool that will hold a lot of water and will attempt to like wick water out of the cocoa, that can be overcome though with a kind of a simple physics act. And that's called just setting your plant on top of the bag or on top of the block and resisting that old school urge to dig a little hole and bury that block either all the way or partly in the soil, or in the cocoa, actually, even submerging that 4x4 by about half an inch or an inch. What it does is once the cocoa's around that plastic wrap, it's sealed up, no air can go under there. And basically you've got a straw now. Then the Rockwool, once that plastic edge is sealed up, can actually suck water back up. And then we don't see good rooting in because we're not pushing water in the right direction through those roots and they're not getting enough oxygen. So that is, I think, one of the biggest things is when you are mixing medias, try to match up, that field capacity as best you can, because you're never going to get that matrix potential to be exactly the same. And then remember that water goes down and we want to do everything we can to keep it from going back up.
Thank you guys for that answer. That was a really good question. And I'm managing a very sad plant right now that I did not root in properly, you guys. So, but I'm taking notes for next year. I'll get it right next year. All right. We got a question here. Let's see. So many questions. Yes, Daniel, thank you so much for your question. All right. We got a question here from Alpine Agronomy. They wrote in, how many plants per 16 square feet do you suggest with a 1 gallon pot? I had better results with 2 gallon at 9 plants per 4x4 square than I did with 16 1 gallon pots per 4x4 square. What do you guys think?
Typically 9 to 12 plants, depending on pot sizes, right? Where we find about the best mix of productivity, quality, because obviously the more packed in your plants are, the more your lower and inner canopy buds are going to suffer. And then also there's a labor turnover, right? Where if it is too intergrown and too thick, it actually takes way, way longer to go in there and de-leaf and defoliate and get any kind of plant work done. So what I've seen from growers going from 16 a light on most strains, if they go back to 12, a lot of times, especially if they start flipping them, really dial in that plant height, they see either equivalent or slightly increased yields just from that change alone, but also a better ratio of that A to B nug, just because we're getting better light penetration and a more uniform and dense overall nug structure.
Yeah, really just kind of comes down to canopy density. And that's some of that's going to have to do with lighting intensity, your point sources of light, and type of strain, how it grows.
Absolutely. And that's something to remember, guys, that with cannabis genetics, there's enough variation. I mean, growing under HPS, I've seen strains that I can pack them in at 16 a light and they do just fine. Some of them do horrible. Some strains I'll de-leaf, pretty hard on that lollipop. Other strains I've grown over the years, I get kind of lazy on the defoliation, and luckily I still end up with some decent golf balls down in that lower canopy. So always remember, everything we say is this is the answer, except in some of these certain situations. So really, crop registration and keeping track of all your variables and then being able to analyze, like, was it the pot size or the plant density that seemed to have the bigger impact on this particular run is kind of the key to dissecting that for different strains over time.
Pot size matters. Awesome. Thank you guys for that. All right. I got a question here on YouTube from John. They wrote, struggling with keeping temps down in week 5 to 6 of flower, averaging about 81 during lights on and only down to 76 at night. Can this result in thinner buds than what's normally desired?
Possibly. Some of the things that might be able to help you is just start, keep your irrigations leaned slightly more generative. If you can't do, some ripening aspects to that that plant, and obviously start to think about what AC capacities that might help you improve those environments.
Yeah, and a part of it too is as your temperature increases, always keep your VPD in mind. So our plant response to drought is, low water, which we should never hit in a controlled irrigation environment, and also high heat and high leaf surface temps. So as your temperature goes up, we want to get that humidity up to keep that VPD in range and keep that, millimeter or two around the leaf surface inside of a range where those stomata stay open and don't go into a drought response. A lot of times when we see like foxtailing, for instance, a big part of it is that humidity is dropped and that immediate area around the leaf surface now is super dry. So the stomata have closed up, and there's two things going on. Well, not two things. One, the eventuality is a thinner bud structure because the plant can't keep itself cool, so it can't pack on as much material in a small area, and that's being caused by those stomata being restricted and the plant not being able to actually grow as productively. So if we have classic really overblown weed that's not doing very good, we will see small, sometimes really tight nugs, sometimes really loose. But if you're running high temps, make sure you're keeping up with your humidity. And also maybe now you know where your next investment needs to be on your grow space, which sounds like AC.
All right, John, let us know how that works for you. Thank you for your question. Just rounding out the hour, y'all. So if you have any questions, you're on with us live. Be sure to drop it in the chat. We'll do our best to get to them. We got a question in. Someone wrote, in Rockwool, is there any benefit in feeding a kelp-based product? We omitted the name of this product, but they claim it will not clog drip emitters, which I find hard to believe. Any feedback would be much appreciated. Kelp-based products. Y'all used anything like that?
I've played with them a little bit. Typically what we're looking at is like a little hormone booster for the plants. Is there validity to it? Slight. There's some scientific evidence to show that different compounds in kelp extracts can be very good, beneficial for plant growth. If you want to implement them, it says it won't clog drippers. I would really look at what that looks like. Does it come out in a clear liquid with the viscosity of water? But, if you're really looking at putting something like that on, maybe look at what the application instructions are and say, okay, is this something that I'm adding every day? Is it something I'm supposed to add once a week, every fifth day? What's the program I'm supposed to be on? And if you really want to, try it, or maybe look at hand supplementing it throughout the room and then, log some of the morphology changes you might see in the plant. But really, when it comes to those supplements, excuse me, we want to eliminate variables as much as possible so if that's what actually made the difference.
Yeah, and the suggestion that I would have is definitely try hand applying it first, because then if you don't see a benefit, it's no cost to stop using it. Whereas if you use it in your lines and it does clog your systems, you're going to be out some investment.
I mean, flashbacks to compost teas, Jason.
I like hand applying compost teas.
Yeah, just don't ever let anyone brew them in your res.
I'll brew them in your res.
Please don't.
We have someone on Hangouts here that had a question.
Yeah.
EG, did you have a question? Not sure if they're still here, but you're welcome to type your question in the chat. We can talk about it.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, there you are.
Hey there. I just wanted to get your guys' opinion about surface leaf temperatures. And we're running CO2 around 1400 and got about 1000 to 1100 par on the plants. And just wanted to understand what your take was on the relationship of the environment and the surface leaf temperatures, where they should be. What the differentiation should be between those two temperatures.
So, really what's going to come down between environmental temperature and leaf surface temp is, one, how much airflow is going on. As these plants are transpiring, the evaporative cooling of the water vapor coming off the surface of the plant is usually going to keep them slightly lower than air temps. And that is obviously depending on how much airflow you have. So if we are reducing how much boundary layer effect that the humidity and the transpiration, evaporation of that water right at the leaf surface occurs, a lot of times you're going to see that a little bit less. And you actually kind of want that because it's going to be easier to manage the whole canopy if we can start to break up some of those boundary layer environments, those micro environments around the leaf surface. And then the other was that radiation that we talked about earlier, where some of the far reds, those higher wavelength photons are actually increasing the surface temperature of the leaf.
Yeah, and I can expand on that a little bit. Typically early on, in veg and early flower, we want to see an average leaf surface temp. I always want to stress average because, just like Jason said, if you take a thermometer and go take 1,000 readings, you're going to have 1,000 slightly different answers. And we're looking for an average trend line that we can actually act on. But we're looking for about 80 to 82 degrees Fahrenheit leaf surface temp early on, dropping that to about, 75 to 78 during bulking, whatever you can kind of manage. And then, during bulking, we're going to start to do about a 5-degree overnight differential that will expand to a 10-degree. And, this is something I don't think we brought up on here, but that is one of the reasons we see, or a lot of people will typically say they see, better results in terms of color and maturation with an HPS. Is part of that is that leaf surface temp differential. So with an HPS, if we're running 75 degrees in the daytime and you're hitting it with that radiant heat from the light, your leaf surface temp might be more like 78, 79, 80, depending on how much airflow you have and how close that leaf is to the light. Well, once the lights go off, our plant's slowly moving back towards ambient room temp. And if that ambient room temp went from 75 to 65, now we've got a 15-degree differential or 12 or 13 on that HPS plant versus, if we were running at 77 in the daytime and our leaf surface was 73 on that LED plant. Now, if we drop that nighttime temp to 65 in the room, now the plant's only got a 7-degree diff or 8-degree diff rather than a 10 to 15-degree diff. So really, everything we do, and I think we've talked about this a little bit on here, is really catering to that few millimeters around the leaf. That leaf surface temperature and leaf surface VPD are really what we're catering our entire environment to.
Yeah, typically when I measure my leaf surface temperature, I'm getting lower than my ambient temperature. And then of course, when I get into higher temperature, like if I'm running 80, I'm maybe getting 76 on the leaf surface. And then, but as I get into 82 degrees, then the differential, it becomes almost nil. And, at that point I start backing off. I feel like I should be backing off, but I don't know. Should there be a reduction or not in the leaf temperature as opposed to the ambient temperature?
Typically, I see it in healthy plants, and kind of what you said about when you get up to 82 in your room. I would guess that the transpiration rate of those plants is decreasing, and that's why you're seeing that leaf surface temperature catch up with the ambient temperature. So I think you're doing the right thing by backing off and not pushing quite that hard.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Okay, great. Thanks so much for that.
EG, thanks for the question. I don't think we've seen you before, so nice to have you on the show.
Oh, right on. Yeah, thank you.
Fantastic. All right. Yeah. Moving on to YouTube. Questions keep on coming. Tyler dropped a comment. They wrote 2 weeks veg, 8-week flower, prune week 3, leaving 12 to 18 inches per cola, defoliate 5 to 10 leaves covering bud sites week 4, final defoliation strip week 7, sufficient plant maintenance regimen. What do you guys think? How's it sound to you?
To me, it sounds like it might be slightly excessive. They might be able to get away with putting just a little bit less labor into that. However, it's nice to hear it scheduled out like a good SOP. I personally probably lean on the side of the little bit lazier type of defoliation, just because it's there's other ways to help manage plant growth as well that are a little bit less labor intensive. That being said, it's hard to argue that a proper amount of defoliation is key for the quality of bud that you're growing.
Yeah, and there's I guess a few different ways to go about it. Like everyone says, there's 1,000 ways to skin a cat.
To defoliate a plant?
To defoliate, there's 1,000 different ways you could do it. Doesn't mean they're all right, though. That's where I was going with that. But yeah, usually going, Jason said it, typically a little more conservatively, setting your plant structure early on. So sometimes when I hear that people don't do anything until week 3, sometimes you can set yourself up for a little better success, especially if you've grown these same strains several times and you're used to how the kind of structure they tend to form. You can get away with like a day 1 or 2, kind of lollipop up or right before you bring them in. And then you can kind of save some labor on that end of stretch defoliation. Typically, I like to do coming out of veg, end of week 3 or whenever the end of stretch is done. And I'll do one more cleanup, typically, around week 7. And in there, be good. If you start ripping leaves too close to harvest, you're going to start encouraging mold just because you've got wounded plants going into your dry room. So that's something you want to look out for. And then if you are in that case where you feel like you need to strip every single leaf from the plant to be able to dry your weed, you might need to upgrade your dry room. Ideally, we want to have, a healthy plant going in. And then the other thing too, always it's a balance when you're defoliating, those leaves are the reason we talk about leaf surface temp and not bud temp is the leaves are what are actually transpiring and photosynthesizing. So overstripping your plants is going to diminish the yield probably more than improper irrigation technique. Plus, of course, you kill the plant, but you can do that either way too.
Great tips. Thank you so much, Tyler. Appreciate your post there. Thank you for sharing your data. Good luck. All right, returning back to some previously submitted questions. Hey, wrote in about pH. If you are seeing lower of the acceptable pH range, say 5.4 into 5.3, is it normal practice to increase your pH feeds to say 6.0 to 6.1, knowing that the medium will be lowering the pH soon, or would there be a different approach?
This is pretty similar to what I think one of our first questions in this episode was, and that is just, what are the appropriate steps for correcting a pH that's slightly off? My first question is what do our EC charts look like? If we really can't make a good decision until we understand whether there's enough nutrients in there to keep that nutrient composition balanced. Obviously, if there's not enough nutrients, there's really nothing else that we can do that's going to end up in even really just a short-term solution. Obviously, you're always going to have long-term issues. And obviously a really short-term correction, of modifying a pH, even if your EC is too low, it's going to be a very short-term change, probably not even a solution. That's kind of what I was getting at there. So, understanding those EC values, are they high enough to sustain a balanced nutrition for that plant? If you're in Rockwool 5.3 to 5.4, I probably wouldn't be too aggressive at making very many changes. I would just kind of keep it in mind and continue to take pH runoff readings. If you're in cocoa, it's probably about the time to start thinking about what might be causing that.
Yeah, without those EC readings, it's really tough to say. And one really important thing to remember when we're looking at these pH swings is, as non-intuitive as it seems, the bigger salt load you have, if you've got 10, and this is outrageous, right? Obviously, but if we had 10,000 ppm of salt in solution and the plant took out 1,500, that's much less impactful than if we had 3,000 ppm of total salt in solution and we removed 1,500 of it. That's going to have a much bigger effect on that pH in the nutrient solution than it would at a higher EC. So although it seems non-intuitive to feed more and more aggressively with more nutrients, if you're at a high EC, we want to look back over time and say, okay, more than likely, what are we looking at? Was it a bad input? Do we have an imbalance because of what the plant's eating? Let's say we've been stacking too much and not pushing runoff appropriately. So we've just slowly edged that pH down over time. Or is it a sudden change? Is it a problem with our input? So you really want to identify, just like Jason said, what is really causing it? And that's going to, lead you to the appropriate steps to fix it. So step 1, if you don't already have it, I would find a way to monitor that root zone EC. With something like the T12, water content is really awesome, but the ability to see that EC in time series with a reasonable amount of accuracy is huge. And it's, I guess we don't always try to sell a Roya, but we've been doing it a lot on this episode, but not a lot of sensors. I get those questions all the time. How high does this sensor read? Well, up to 30, we shouldn't see anything going above 30 in a healthy plant growing system. So you can really make a lot of good choices once you have the numbers.
Yeah. And I think kind of the way I like to think about it is I would rather be slightly overfeeding than slightly underfeeding. When we think about available nutrients, the plant has some ability to regulate its nutrient uptake. And so if there are, elements of each kind that the plant is pulling up, macro and micro nutrition, then if we have just slightly too much, that plant's going to regulate how much uptakes and it's going to stay balanced. Yet on the other end, if we're slightly underfeeding, it's going to become unbalanced simply because it's using up all available of certain elements.
Yeah, I guess a good way I like to put it is, I don't know, a decade ago when I started looking into growing in my own closet and stuff and found out about growing in cocoa coir versus peat moss, which is something I was familiar with from other industries. One of the early texts I read was to mix up your nutrient solution in a 5-gallon bucket. If you've got 1-gallon pots, go dunk them till they stop bubbling, hold them up and let it drain out. And the idea was we're resetting the EC in that medium to 3.0 every day. So we're having full control over resetting what the pH is going to be, what the EC is going to be, and making sure that's exactly where we want it. Now that's about as low tech as you can get in monitoring or in managing EC and pH inside your root zone. It's blunt force and it works, but it's also incredibly expensive. And you obviously couldn't afford to just flush your entire room of plants to exactly what you want your root zone EC to be every day. Your water usage would be just completely not economical.
Yeah. And, kind of building up the knowledge behind how to avoid this in the future is going to be one of the key things that helps you crop steer in the long run. Because so many of these methods that we're using to combat an effect is a reactive type of process. And it's really hard to be crop steering when we have too many reactive treatments going on throughout a cycle.
Yeah. And actually, I'll be a salesman again. If we go back to our other question before Roya, time series data for your entire run. When you can look back, that's something I help people with pretty frequently is going, okay, we've got this pH situation. How do we make a decision? Okay, you haven't been able to stack your EC above a 4.0, and now we're in week 6. So we've been at a point where the plant's been riding on the ragged edge of having enough nutrition. And now we just hit the point in plant growth where the plant's taking out either more than we can put in, or it's taking out so much that we can't really reset that ionic balance without doing some sort of incredibly massive feed that might, end up actually shocking the plant.
Fantastic, you guys. Thank you so much for that overview. All right, we got a comment here from Spaceship Tech. Welcome to the show, Spaceship. I don't think we've met you before. And they wrote, this is a good one, we're probably going to close out on this one. They wrote, when in ripening phase, my input EC is 1.5. What are some, if any, target substrate EC ranges for my final watering? What advice do y'all have there?
It depends on what you built up to throughout that run. As you're building up EC in the root zone, that plant's adapting. We have the ability to change that osmotic balance, the amount of salt that's on one side of that osmotic balance anyway, really quickly by pumping too much water through there and really lowering the amount of salt or massively raising it up if we happen to feed it way too high of an EC. So when you're riding out, your last weeks of ripening, really targeting when those plants stop feeding to try to figure out when you want to taper off your EC. That's part of why we look at, certain nutrient programs that'll say, hey, run a 3.0 all the way through. Well, part of that is because if your plant is actually ripening on its own determinate timeline, it will eventually slow down and mostly stop feeding. And at that point, most of what you're pumping into it is going down the drain, right? But what we want to do is keep that EC from either spiking up too high, massively over drying it, or dropping out. If you're at a 7 baseline and you drop to 0, the plant can adapt quickly enough to continue to uptake water and nutrients, and you're going to cause some root death. So I wish it was a simpler answer, but if you've been in a 5 to 10 range, start trying to keep it in that range and maybe slowly bring it down over 2 weeks, but don't try to step it down more than a half a point in EC a day typically.
Yeah, and just to try and put some concrete numbers, I'm just going to work off of Seth's 5 to 10 through vegetative bulking. If you cut that EC to 1.5, you're probably going to see root zone ECs between 3 and 15, or 2 and 20, depending on how aggressive your generative steering is during ripening.
Yep. And that's, one thing we really try to focus on in ripening is how big is that EC swing getting? And, just as Jason said, we can react to it, but the real value is looking at, okay, here's my buildup over time. What happens if it's too quick? What happens if it's too slow? What happens if I'm not pushing appropriate runoff? How is that affecting how I'm coming into ripening?
Amazing, you guys. Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who submitted questions. We had so many good conversations today. We really love hearing from y'all. So appreciate that. Seth and Jason, rocking it as usual. Good to see you guys. Thank you for this session. To producer Chris, thank you. All right, if you're looking for some Arroyo gear, don't forget arroyo.shop is now open for business. Head over there to get you some merch. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this week's episode of Arroyo Office Hours. We do this every Thursday, and the best way to get answers from the experts is to join us live. If you want to learn more about Arroyo, book a demo at arroyo.io, and one of our experts will be happy to walk you through all the ways it can be used to improve your cultivation production process. If you have a topic you'd like us to cover on Office Hours, post questions anytime in the Arroyo app. Drop your questions in the chat or on our YouTube. Send us an email to sales@arroyo.io. Note that new address, sales@arroyo.io, or DMS. We are on all the socials. We want to hear from you. We'll send everyone in attendance a link to today's video. It'll also live on the Arroyo YouTube channel. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share while you're there. And we'll see you at the next session. Thanks, everybody.